May 12, 1945. The ceramic factory outside Augsburg smelled of wet brick and coal smoke, the kind that clings to wool and won't wash out. Lieutenant Robert Keller stood in the main hall counting bodies instead of crates. 843 displaced persons, mostly women and children, pressed against the walls of a facility designed for 200. His orders were explicit: maintain control of German civilians until transfer to civil authority. Do not compromise military stocks. The regulation was clear. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force Directive 0847 prohibited direct aid to enemy civilians without authorization. Violation meant supply cutoff and disciplinary action. But the children in the courtyard held empty cooking pots, and the inventory ledger showed 18,000 K rations sitting in the depot. Keller had spent 3 years calculating fuel consumption, salt rations, and grain reserves from Sicily to Bavaria. He understood numbers. What he didn't understand was how to square the equation when one side was regulation and the other was starvation. Robert Keller learned accounting from this father, who ran a grain elevator in Nebraska and could calculate bushel weight by the sound corn made hitting a truck bed. Numbers made sense. Numbers didn't lie or panic or bleed. At 29, Keller had risen to quartermaster lieutenant through pure competence. He could tell you the diesel consumption of a Sherman tank at 12 miles per hour, the shelf life of powdered eggs in summer heat, or how many wool blankets a battalion needed for a Rhineland winter. His file was spotless. His reports arrived on time, his inventories balanced. The war made him methodical. Sicily taught him that water mattered more than ammunition when the wells ran dry. Salerno showed him that hungry men made mistakes. By the time the 45th Infantry Division crossed into Bavaria, Keller had developed a sixth sense for supply chains. He knew when a convoy would arrive before the radio man did, could smell spoiled meat through a sealed container, and spotted black market pilfering by tracking discrepancies smaller than most officers would notice. His commanding officer, Major Dawson, called him the human calculator. His sergeants called him decimal point, but with respect, the kind soldiers reserve for men who keep them fed when everything else falls apart. Keller didn't think of himself as compassionate. Compassion was a luxury. He dealt in logistics. But logistics had rules, and rules assumed normal conditions. Germany in May 1945 wasn't normal. It was collapse, the kind where cities emptied into the countryside and people walked until they couldn't anymore. The ceramic factory had been chosen because it had a roof and proximity to rail lines. What nobody anticipated was that 800 civilians would appear within 72 hours, drawn by rumors that Americans handed out bread. The first days followed protocol exactly. Keller established 2 kitchens. One served American soldiers. The second served foreign forced laborers identified by tattoos or documentation. Polish, French, Russian, they got hot meals. German civilians got access to water and a place to sleep on concrete floors. No food. The regulation was explicit on that point. Don't feed the enemy population. Let German authorities handle German problems. The logic made sense on paper. Resources were limited. Soldiers came first, then Allied nationals, then nothing. The system held until the 3rd morning, when Keller walked through the courtyard and saw a girl, maybe 4 years old, holding a dented pot. She wasn't crying, just standing there, skinny enough that her dress hung like a tarp on tent poles. Behind her, 16 more children waited in a line their mothers had organized. The mothers didn't approach. They just stood back, watching, hoping. Keller kept walking. He went to his office, a converted foreman's space with a desk and a field telephone. He opened the inventory ledger and stared at the numbers. 18,000 K rations, 3.2 tons of dried beans, enough powdered milk to float a battleship. The next convoy wouldn't arrive for 11 days. His clerk, Corporal Davis, knocked and entered. "Sir, the German women are asking if we have extra bread." Keller didn't look up. "Tell them no." Davis hesitated. "Even for the kids?" Keller closed the ledger. "Especially for the kids. If we feed one, we feed all 800. We don't have authorization." Davis nodded and left, but the knock came again an hour later. This time it was Sergeant Briggs, built like a freight car and twice as stubborn. "Lieutenant, we got rations rotting in the back shed. Stuff from November. You want me to dump it or can we use it?" Keller looked at him. Briggs wasn't stupid. He knew what he was asking. "How much?" Keller asked. "Maybe 200 meals worth, give or take." Keller thought for 30 seconds. "Listed as spoilage, transport damage." "Then see if the French cook needs help with cleanup duty." Briggs smiled slightly. "Cleanup duty. Got it, sir." The next morning, 20 German children were officially employed as cleanup crew. They received 1 meal each for their labor. The meal came from rations marked spoiled. The system was born in that moment, built on euphemism and careful phrasing. If questioned, Keller could point to regulations allowing use of damaged goods for non-combat personnel engaged in facility maintenance. It was thin justification, but it was justification, and it worked for exactly 4 days before the scope of the problem grew too large to hide behind paperwork tricks. Marie Delacourt ran the field kitchen, French, 50-something, with hands like worn leather and a voice that could crack ice. She'd been a cook in Lyon before the war, ended up in a work camp in Austria, liberated by the Americans in April. When Keller's battalion needed someone who knew how to stretch rations and wouldn't steal, Marie volunteered. She didn't speak much English, but she understood quantities, temperatures, and hunger. On the 5th day, Marie came to Keller's office and said 3 words: "They are dying." Keller looked up from a fuel consumption report. Marie pointed outside. "The babies. They are dying. You see or you don't see." Keller went to the courtyard. In the corner, under a tarp, 2 German women sat with infants. The babies weren't crying. That was the problem. Healthy babies cried. These lay still, eyes half open, breathing shallow. Keller had seen it before in Sicily, in France. Starvation didn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it just looked like sleep. He returned to his office and ran the numbers again. 5% of current stock diverted to civilian feeding would sustain operations for 30 days. The risk was the daily radio report to Quartermaster Depot 24. Every evening, he transmitted consumption figures. Any discrepancy triggered an audit. But the reports allowed for losses: transport damage, spoilage, breakage. Standard wastage was calculated at 3%. If he stayed under 5% and spread the discrepancy across multiple categories, the numbers might hold. He called Briggs and Davis. "Starting tonight, we're feeding the children under 5. Classify it as test rations for cleanup personnel. Keep detailed logs. If anyone asks, these are workers maintaining facility hygiene." Davis frowned. "Sir, that's not exactly—" Keller cut him off. "I know what it is, Corporal. Write it up the way I said." The first night, they fed 34 children. The mothers wept. Not loud crying, just tears running down faces too tired to make sound. Keller watched from the office window and felt something crack in his chest. Not guilt. Guilt implied he'd done something wrong. This was something else. The recognition that numbers on a page represented breathing human bodies, and that his decision to manipulate those numbers meant children lived or died. He went back to his desk and forged the evening report. Transport losses, 48 rations. He transmitted it and waited. No response came. The system held. By the third week of May, Keller had refined the operation into an invisible machine. Rations marked as transport losses, 200 per week. Bread from the rail depot recorded as incomplete delivery, 300 loaves. Powdered milk classified as damaged packaging, 18 pounds. The real result was 200 daily meals for German civilians in severe malnutrition. Marie ran the distribution with military precision. Mothers registered their children, received meal tickets, lined up at designated times. No crowds, no chaos. To outside observers, it looked like a standard feeding program for facility workers. Only the sergeants knew different, and they were split. Some helped. Sergeant Briggs became an expert at creative inventory notation. Corporal Davis typed falsified manifests without complaint. Private Chen, who ran the warehouse, developed a gift for mislabeling crates. Others objected quietly. Staff Sergeant Morrison told Keller he was risking court-martial for people who'd cheered Hitler 6 months ago. Keller didn't argue. He just said, "Noted," and kept signing requisition forms. Major Dawson knew. Had to know. He visited twice a week, walked through the facility, saw the children eating, never asked direct questions, never demanded reports. Dawson had been in North Africa, seen whole villages starve while supply depots overflowed. He understood the math Keller was running and chose to look at cloud formations instead of feeding lines. That kind of command decision, the willful blindness that let good things happen, required its own courage. But Dawson also warned Keller once, over coffee in the makeshift officer's mess. Keep it small, keep it invisible. The moment someone higher up notices, I can't protect you. Keller nodded. Understood, sir. Dawson stirred his coffee. For what it's worth, you're doing the right thing. Just don't make me say that officially. They never spoke of it again. On May 28, a convoy of 3 GMC trucks arrived with canned goods and flour. The manifest specified use exclusively for division troops and identified prisoners of war. Keller looked at the paperwork, then at the courtyard where the civilian population had doubled overnight. Refugees kept arriving, following rumors of American generosity. The depot now held 912 people in space meant for 200. He made a decision that crossed from creative accounting into outright theft. One truck was diverted to the factory yard. Keller logged it as delayed for mechanical inspection. When the tailgate dropped and the first crate opened, the sound brought women running. They stopped 10 feet away, afraid to approach, afraid the food would vanish. Marie started distribution. Biscuits, canned beef, chocolate bars. Simple things that represented 3 months' worth of calories for families who'd been eating potato peels and tree bark. The reaction caught Keller off guard. He'd expected relief, maybe gratitude. What he got was grief. Women in their 50s knelt in the dirt and sobbed. Teenage girls clutched tins of meat and shook with silent crying. One grandmother took a chocolate bar, broke it into 6 pieces, and handed them to grandchildren who stared like they'd seen magic. Keller stood near the truck and watched something he hadn't anticipated. The food mattered. Of course it mattered. But more than that, the act of receiving mattered. The fact that someone in uniform had looked at them and decided they deserved to eat. That recognition broke something in them, the armor they built to survive shame and collapse. The interpreter, a German school teacher working for the military government, approached Keller afterward. "They want to thank you," he said, "but they're afraid." Keller shook his head. "Tell them it's just rations, nothing special." The interpreter smiled sadly. "To them, Lieutenant, it is everything." The act of compassion became an administrative problem within 48 hours. On May 30th, A patrol from the military government detachment arrived for routine stock inspection. 2 lieutenants and a sergeant with clipboards and suspicion. They counted crates, checked seals, compared manifests against physical inventory. They found discrepancies. 1,200 K rations unaccounted for. 900 pounds of flour missing. The lead inspector, Lieutenant Fletcher, was polite but firm. This could be clerical error. We'll note it and return next week for verification. Keller knew what that meant. The next visit would include auditors from Corps headquarters. If the numbers didn't reconcile, the facility would be shut down and he'd face charges. He'd moved from creative accounting to outright falsification. There was no explaining away an entire missing truck. That night, Keller called a meeting with his senior sergeants. 8 men crowded into the office. Briggs, Davis, Morrison, Chen, the others. Keller laid out the situation. We have 2 options. Stop the feeding program now and hope the audit finds clerical errors, not deliberate fraud. Or, we document everything officially as humanitarian relief and ask Major Dawson to authorize it retroactively. Morrison spoke first. If we stop, those people starve. If we go official, you get court-martialed and we all get reassigned. Chen, the quietest of the group, said, "There's a third option, sir. We all sign a statement saying we authorize the distribution independently without your knowledge. Spread the blame." Keller shook his head. Not happening. This was my call. Briggs leaned forward. Then we go to Dawson. Let him make the decision. That was the move Keller had been avoiding. Dawson had protected him through silence. Forcing him to choose between defending a subordinate or following regulations wasn't fair. But fairness was another luxury in short supply. While Keller wrestled with institutional dilemmas, the institutional climate hardened around him. American newspapers started running stories about fraternization, soldiers trading cigarettes for German souvenirs, officers attending parties with former Wehrmacht families. Public opinion back home turned skeptical. Why were we helping the enemy? The political pressure rolled downhill. In early June, Eisenhower's headquarters reiterated standing orders. German populations must provide for themselves from their own resources. No exceptions without written authorization. That directive landed on every command desk in the European theater. Major Dawson received his copy and called Keller immediately. The next convoy will be inspected piece by piece. You need to cut your losses or make this right. Keller asked what making it right looked like. Dawson sighed. I don't know, but if they find fraud, I can't save you. Keller made a calculation colder than anything he'd done before. He cut military rations by 15%. Not enough to harm combat readiness, but enough to free up supplies he could then funnel to civilian feeding and claim as efficiency improvements. He presented it to the men as conservation during transition to peacetime operations. Most accepted it. A few grumbled. Keller documented the change as recovering transport weight, standard logistics optimization. The math held for 10 days. The freed supplies fed 400 civilians who would have otherwise gone without. But the cost was visible at the American mess tables. Smaller portions, shorter lines, less waste. Keller ate the same rations as his men. When Private Dominguez asked why the servings had shrunk, Keller said, "Supply line adjustments, temporary." Dominguez didn't push. Soldiers rarely questioned officers who shared their discomfort. The rupture came on June 9th. Major Dawson was reassigned to Corps headquarters, promoted to Deputy Logistics Coordinator. His replacement arrived the same afternoon. Captain Harold Jeffers, 36, lawyer in civilian life, ran the military government's property accountability section. Jeffers believed in documentation, verification, and the rule of law. He did not believe in creative interpretation of regulations. His first act was to order a complete inventory of the facility. Every crate opened, every can counted, every seal examined. The process took 6 hours. When it finished, Jeffers sat across from Keller in the cramped office and laid out the findings. "You're missing 1 full truckload of supplies, approximately 1,500 pounds of food. I need an explanation." Keller had prepared for this. He presented a detailed log of freezer losses, a common problem when refrigeration units failed. Spoiled meat, condemned vegetables, unusable dairy. Jeffers reviewed the paperwork. "This says the freezer failed on May 15th. The inspection report from May 12th shows all equipment operational." Keller kept his voice level. "Intermittent failure, not detected until spoilage occurred." Jeffers wasn't convinced, but lacked evidence to prove fraud. He suspended immediate action pending full audit from Corps. Until the auditors arrive, this facility Corporal Davis found Keller that night, sitting in the dark office, staring at inventory sheets. "Sir, Private Chen wants permission to distribute his personal rations." Keller shook his head. "Denied. If Jeffers sees that, he'll bring charges against Chen." Davis persisted. "Marie already gave hers away, took her whole dinner to the German section. Jeffers didn't see it." Keller closed his eyes. "Tell Marie I said thank you, and tell her not to do it again." But Marie did do it again. So did Chen. So did Briggs. By the 3rd day, half the American soldiers in the facility were sharing portions of their meals with German civilians, unauthorized, unrecorded. Jeffers noticed the decrease in mess hall attendance and launched an investigation. Before it concluded, orders came through. The facility would close. All German civilians transferred to a larger UNRRA camp 40 miles away. Processing would begin immediately. On the final morning, June 14th, 3 buses arrived to transport the civilians. Mothers packed bundles. Children lined up quietly. As the first group boarded, an elderly woman approached Keller. She said nothing, just placed something in his hand and walked away. He looked down. A white handkerchief, hand embroidered with the word "Danke." "Thank you." Keller folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. He watched the buses pull away, dust rising behind them, and wondered if any of it had mattered. The children had eaten for 3 weeks. That was something. But the regulations had won. The system had reasserted itself. By evening, the factory stood empty, except for American personnel preparing for transfer. Captain Jeffers submitted his final report. Inventory discrepancies noted. Investigation pending. Facility closed without incident. What Keller didn't know was that Major Dawson, from his new position at Corps, had received Jeffers' preliminary findings. Dawson made a call to the Inspector General's office and requested the case be reviewed through his desk first. When the file arrived, he reclassified the missing supplies as inventory error due to evacuation pressure, standard accounting discrepancy in fluid combat zones. The explanation satisfied the auditors. No fraud charges filed. No disciplinary action recommended. The file was archived. Dawson never told Keller what he'd done. 3 weeks later, Keller received orders transferring him to Nuremberg for trial support logistics. He packed his gear, filed his final reports, and left Bavaria without ceremony. The ceramic factory was dismantled. The kitchen equipment sold to local authorities. By August, the site was empty except for foundation stones and the smell of old smoke. The institutional consequences took longer to materialize. In early 1946, the Quartermaster Corps began reviewing occupation period operations, looking for lessons learned. Staff officers noticed a pattern in after-action reports from Bavaria, repeated references to local commanders making unauthorized but effective decisions on civilian relief. One memo specifically mentioned Augsburg, describing redistributed supplies that prevented disease outbreaks. The language was vague, no names attached, but the concept was clear. Rigid adherence to regulations had sometimes conflicted with practical humanitarian needs. In March 1946, the QM Corps issued Technical Manual FM 1015, updated with a new appendix. Section 7C, what had been forbidden, was now doctrine, born from field experience that no one officially acknowledged. The human consequences were harder to track. Marie Delacourt transferred to Red Cross service and spent 3 years in displaced persons camps across Germany. In 1952, she wrote a letter to a French veterans magazine describing an American lieutenant who'd fed starving children by manipulating inventory records. The letter didn't name Keller. It didn't need to. Among the German families relocated from Augsburg, word spread about the officer who'd bent rules. One of those families included a girl named Hildegard Meller. She was 6 years old when American soldiers gave her canned beef and chocolate. She remembered the taste. She remembered the soldier who handed it to her without smiling, but with steady hands. In 1968, Hildegard, now a schoolteacher in Stuttgart, learned that American Army records were being declassified. She wrote to the Veterans Affairs Office asking for information about officers stationed in Augsburg in May 1945. The letter never reached Keller. He died 5 years earlier, heart attack at age 57, working as a regional comptroller for a farm equipment company in Nebraska. The final consequence played out in the physical space itself. In 1948, the town of Augsburg reclaimed the factory site and converted it into a primary school. During reconstruction, workers salvaged steel beams from the American field kitchen. Those beams became support structures for new classrooms. On the walls, beneath fresh plaster, chalk marks remained. Lot 45B, beans. Lot 62C, flour. The children who attended that school never knew they were learning math in a space where mathematics had once meant survival, where one man's ability to manipulate numbers had translated into meals that prevented death. By 1955, the school expanded. The old factory walls came down, but the cornerstone, salvaged from the original building, carried an inscription added by the German Reconstruction Committee. In memory of those who sheltered here, 1945. No mention of Americans. No mention of Keller. Just acknowledgement that shelter once had mattered. Robert Keller never wrote memoirs. He kept no diary. When fellow veterans asked about his service, he talked about logistics and supply chains. Never about decisions made in a ceramic factory outside Augsburg. To him, the episode had been an accounting deviation, a brief period where the ledger didn't balance, and he'd chosen to accept the discrepancy. He didn't see heroism in it. He saw arithmetic with human variables, an equation where regulations demanded one answer, but conscience calculated another. The numbers told the story better than words. 32 days of operation. 5,000 military rations distributed normally. 4,200 redistributed without authorization. 0 deaths from foodborne illness. 0 fraud convictions. But the numbers couldn't measure what happened when a German mother saw her child eat for the first time in weeks, or when an American sergeant falsified a manifest to make that possible, or when a command structure looked away long enough to let morality override procedure. The war ended not with proclamations, but with gestures small enough to miss. A convoy diverted here, a manifest altered there, a bowl of soup served outside regulations. These accumulated into survival, not dramatic or photographed, just the stubborn insistence that starvation was unacceptable, regardless of nationality or orders. Keller understood that. He'd watched cities burn and armies collapse. He'd calculated fuel for tanks and morphine for wounded. But the calculation he remembered, late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, was simpler. 843 people, 18,000 rations, 5% diverted, 32 days. The numbers balanced if you weighted human life heavier than regulations. And for 3 weeks in Bavaria, while the world rebuilt and policies solidified, that's exactly what he'd done. The cost was career risk and institutional pressure. The return was children who lived. Years later, when historians analyzed post-war occupation feeding policies, they found scattered references to field commanders exercising initiative beyond written authority. Some incidents were documented, most weren't. In the gaps between official records, where manifests didn't quite match, and inventory showed unexplained losses, lived the truth of what happened when regulations met reality. Keller's name appeared nowhere in those histories. His file showed competent service, honorable discharge, no commendations for humanitarian action, because there had been no official humanitarian action. Just a quartermaster who understood that numbers were tools, not gods, and that sometimes the most important calculation was knowing when the equation demanded a different kind of math. The ceramic factory became a school. The school became a memory. But somewhere in German records, in family stories passed down, in the life of a teacher who once was a starving child, the echo remained. An American officer with a ledger and a choice, who looked at hungry faces and decided that rules could bend if bending them meant children ate. That was the lesson Robert Keller never intended to teach. Compassion wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic speeches. It was about finding the gap between what was ordered and what was necessary, and having the courage to step into that space, armed with nothing but a pencil, a ledger, and the willingness to mark losses where there were none, so that life could be counted where regulations said it shouldn't exist. The math was simple. The execution was not. But for 32 days in a factory that smelled of wet brick and coal smoke, the equation balanced. And when it did, 800 people survived long enough to see what came next. That was enough. It had to be.